Hello, welcome to Holbury Kids. My name is Annabel and I am going to tell you the story of Airy Fairy Magic Muddle. The author is called Margaret Ryan.
Airy Fairy climbed back down the rhododendron bush and sat down on a big stone to have a think. Clunk! Something hit her on the head. "What was that?" she said, and picked it up. It was a pine nut. Where did that come from? She wondered. I don't see any pine trees. She looked around, and there, sitting high up in the rhododendron bush, was the red squirrel she'd seen earlier. "Hello, Mr. Squirrel," she called. "Can you help me? I'm looking for the rose garden and I'm lost." The red squirrel swung easily to the ground and crouched down to let Airy Fairy climb on his back. Then he set off. Airy Fairy clung on tight to his tufty ears. Sometimes they travelled over the ground, sometimes through the air. The red squirrel brought Airy Fairy out, not at the rose garden but at the cabbage patch. Most of the other fairies were there already and cheered as Airy Fairy slid off his back at the finishing line. "Oh, you are lucky, Airy Fairy," said Buttercup. "Imagine getting a ride on a red squirrel. He was lovely." "But where did you get to, Airy Fairy?" asked Tingle. "I thought you were following me." "I was," said Airy Fairy, and told them what had happened. "How awful," said Buttercup. "You could have been lost for days or weeks," said Tingle. They were just about to head back to school for lunch when Scary Fairy appeared. She stopped short in surprise. "How did you get there before me?" she asked Airy Fairy. "I thought you were." "I thought she was where?" Scary Fairy asked Tingle. "Nowhere," muttered Scary Fairy and turned and ran back to school. But not before the friends had noticed how muddy the number on her back was. Almost as though she'd changed the number, then tried to rub it out again, said Buttercup. "You mean she led Airy Fairy into the rhododendron jungle?" said Tingle. Buttercup nodded. "Oh no," said Airy Fairy. "As if these fairy Olympics weren't bad enough, I've got Scary Fairy's rotten tricks to worry about as well." Chapter 7. The day of the Fairy Olympics arrived, and all the fairies were up early to greet their guests. "Put on your best school frocks," Fairy Grupplerthrope had instructed the fairies, "and remember to smile nicely and be polite." But Airy Fairy couldn't find her best school frock. "I had it on over the holidays when we all went out to tea with Mr. and Mrs. Goblin and all the little goblins, but I don't know where it went after that." "Oh, yes, I do." And she dived under her bed and found it in among the apple cores and sweet wrappers. Her best frock was in a terrible state. One of the little goblins had covered it in jam when she'd sat on her knee. "Oh, well, perhaps no one will notice," said Airy Fairy. "It's only a little bit crumpled and sticky." Chief Inspector Naralt arrived at the academy first. Fairy Gropplerthrope, she said. How nice to see you. Your fairies are looking very smart. Well, most of them, she added, spying Airy Fairy's sticky frock. Airy Fairy tried to cover up the jam stain with her hand. Let me introduce you to the fairies, Chief Inspector Naralt, said Miss Stickler. This is my niece, Scary Fairy. She's our best student, and this, I'm afraid, is Airy Fairy, who's not. Suddenly there was a flapping noise overhead, and a large sparrowhawk circled the oak tree. He went round and round in ever-decreasing circles, fixing them all with his yellow eye, till a figure dropped neatly from his back and made a perfect landing on a sturdy bough. Freddie Sprite had arrived. The sparrowhawk swooped away as Freddie waved his thanks. Morning, all, he turned to grin at everyone. I told you I would drop in on the Fairy Olympics, and I've brought an extra special prize with me. I think you'll like it. So good luck to all of you. The fairies went to change into their tracksuits. Then they all climbed down into the garden. The grown-ups took their places inside the upturned orange box the fairies had made into a spectator stand, and the Fairy Olympics began. First, there was the 10-meter sprint, held right in front of the spectator stand. Airy Fairy checked that her laces were tied and took a big deep breath. Try not to be lost, try not to be lost, she kept muttering to herself. Ready, steady, go! Miss Stickler fired the starting pistol and the fairies were off down the long gravel path. Scary Fairy elbowed her way out in front. Airy Fairy ran as fast as she could. She couldn't let Fairy Gropplerthrope down in front of Chief Inspector Naralt. But where were the rest of her class? She could only see Scary Fairy ahead of her. She glanced behind her. There they were. She must be second in the race. But could she catch up with Scary Fairy? Then she remembered how fast she had run at the Elf Club when Scary Fairy had tampered with the walking machine. Vroom! Her little legs speeded up as she passed Scary Fairy and crossed the finishing line first. Airy Fairy couldn't believe it. Neither could Scary Fairy. Where did you come from, Airy Fairy? She hissed. Everyone knows I'm the fastest fairy in the school. But Fairy Gropplerthrope was jumping up and down and clapping her hands. Well done, Airy Fairy, she called. Very well done indeed. Nice one, little fairy, grinned Freddie. Sprite Magic. Was that the sticky fairy who won? Asked Chief Inspector Naralt. Next came the pony race. Oh, help, said Airy Fairy. I must remember to face the right way this time. Bet you fall off again, muttered Scary Fairy. I'll see to that. But Airy Fairy heard her this time. Then she remembered how Scary Fairy had tied the belt of her frock to her chair at assembly, and she reached down and tied the laces of her trainers to the stirrups. "I won't fall off this time," she said, and she didn't, not even when Scary Fairy picked the little white pony with her wand and made him rear up and gallop faster than ever. Airy Fairy stayed on and passed the finishing line first. Airy Fairy couldn't believe it. Neither could Scary Fairy. "I don't know how you're doing it, Airy Fairy," she said, "but I'll beat you in the obstacle race. You're hopeless at climbing ropes. You always fall off." Airy Fairy gulped. She knew that was true. The obstacle race was set up in front of the spectator stand. This race had been Chief Inspector Narrold's idea. "It will tell me how fit your fairies really are," she told her Fairy Grupplerthrope. There was a large climbing frame with ropes to cross, brown sacks to crawl through, and a paddling pool to swim over. Fairy Grupplerthrope wasn't keen on the race. "At least let me put warm water in the paddling pool," she said. "It is winter time, but Chief Inspector Narrold wouldn't allow it. A little cold water never hurt anyone," she said. The fairies lined up. Miss Stickler fired the starting pistol and they were off. To her surprise, Airy Fairy climbed up and down the ropes with ease. This was much easier than climbing to the top of a rhododendron bush. Then she swung across the climbing frame, just like swinging from the branches of the oak tree. Crawling through the dark brown sack was no problem compared to the dark rhododendron jungle, and when she got to the paddling pool, some of it had turned to ice. Airy Fairy smiled, jumped onto the ice and whizzed across it. She plunged into the icy water in the middle. "At least there's no pondweed in here," she spluttered as she swam quickly to the other side and hauled herself out and across the finishing line. She was too busy emptying out her trainers to hear the cheering. She was too busy trying to get her wet hair out of her eyes to see Fairy Grupplerthrope beckoning her towards the stand. "Go and collect your prize, Airy Fairy," whispered Tingle. "You've won the Fairy Olympics." What? Airy Fairy could hardly believe. Neither could Scary Fairy. "How did you do it?" she muttered. "I bet you cheated." "No, I didn't," Airy Fairy grinned. "With all your nasty tricks, you helped me practice. Thank you, Scary Fairy." Scary Fairy made a scary face as Airy Fairy went up onto the platform to receive her prize. "Very good, Airy Fairy," said Chief Inspector Narrold, presenting her with a silver trophy. "You're the fittest fairy, and a credit to Fairy Grupplerthrope's Academy." "Well done, Airy Fairy," smiled Fairy Grupplerthrope as she took off her cloak and wrapped it round Airy Fairy. "You didn't slow down at all, little fairy," smiled Freddie Sprite. "I bet you're the fastest fairy in the world." "Hey, that could be the title of my next hit song. Now there's the special prize," I said. "I would present the winner 2 tickets to my next concert." "Oh, thank you," said Airy Fairy. Then she stopped and thought, but I'm sorry, I can't accept them. Why not? Don't you like my singing? Said Freddie Sprite. I love it, said Airy Fairy, but I've got more than one friend and it wouldn't be fair to choose. I see. Freddie Sprite was thoughtful too. You know, Fairy Grupplerthrope, he said, I think you have a really nice little fairy here, but my concert is a sellout and there are no more tickets. So how about if I come to the academy one day soon and sing to all of you? Oh, that would be wonderful, beamed Fairy Grupplerthrope. Can I come too? Asked Chief Inspector Narrolt. Everyone can come, said Airy Fairy, and held up her little silver trophy for all to see. The fairies cheered and Airy Fairy smiled happily. She really needn't have done all that worrying. The Fairy Olympics had turned out brilliantly after all. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe it. Bye!